I hope you've all had a chance to see the exhibition, which has just opened in Gallery 14, which is a consideration of the artist's late works. And whilst, you know, we are the catalogue and the exhibition is very much a consideration of the artist's practice, I think that people are equally interested and intrigued by the man himself. So we decided to ask Mr. Lawrence Daws, himself a very distinguished Australian artist, who had befriended and spent some time with Ian Fairweather on Bribie Island in the 1970s, to come and speak to us about those experiences. So it's a very special occasion. Thanks for coming along, Lawrence.
Thank you.
So Lawrence is now based in South Australia, but has had a long relationship to living and working in Queensland, both on Bribie Island and also in the Glasshouse Mountains. But he's travelled to be with us here from South Australia. And my first question, though, is, when did you first hear about Ian Fairweather?
When I was a student in Melbourne in the early 50s, 52 I think, when Fairweather made his fantastic raft trip. We were in awe of somebody who could actually do that. And we didn't know anything about Fairweather or his work at that point, but we hunted up a few images that would be reproduced, usually in black and white, in newspapers and things, following his trip. But that's the first time we ever heard about Fairweather, and we regarded it with great awe that somebody could just head off in a raft like that.
So very much the mythology and caught the imagination of the young artist.
Certainly, it set the code for a whole lot of artists after that, just thinking of somebody who could just do that.
Absolutely. And so you came to live in Bribie Island much later than that, in 1970, is that right, Laurie?
Yes.
Why did you come to Brisbane, and why did you choose Bribie Island to live on?
Well, I didn't actually choose Bribie Island myself. I'd been in England for about 10, 12 years, and my dealer, Brian Johnson, I was having an exhibition in the end of 1970 with him, and I returned to Australia at the end of 1969, beginning of 1970, and he'd found a place for me to live and work on Bribie Island. And I was delighted, of course, because he'd told me this while I was still in London and still painting there in the last 3 months in London. And I actually knew Fairweather was on Bribie Island. I did a small painting called IF on Bribie Island, and I still have it. It's just a silhouette from the back with white hair with this light coming through it. And I'd done an earlier one of John Mulvey, just called J.M. at Mount Cotton. The only two paintings I've ever painted of two people in Queensland who I admired greatly. Anyway, I was delighted that Johnston had found me a place on Bribie Island where I could meet up with Fairweather.
And can you describe the island at this time? Where were you living? What was the community like?
A much smaller community than now. The bridge had only been in place for a few years. Before that, everyone travelled by boat, a ferry boat that came from Brisbane to Redcliffe and on to Bribie. I'll give it. There was an innocence about it that isn't there anymore. I remember we woke up one morning, for example, and there wasn't a soul around. We thought, God, what's happened, you know? So we went to the local store and said, you know, where is everybody? And they said, quite airily, oh, they're all out on Gilligan's Island. And we wondered what this was all about. And it turned out that at the lowest neap tide of each year, they would, a sandbar would emerge and stay above the tide line for about 8 hours. And the guys with boats would take everyone out there. They'd lift old ladies in, and chairs and tables, and set up a roulette table, a bar, thinking technically they're outside of the international waters, but they're only quite a short distance.
An illegal casino.
Absolutely. Everyone got pretty smashed and had a great time gambling. So we thought this is a great place to come. And they did. See, I bet they don't do that now, but they had been doing that for a number of years.
Yeah.
In itself, Bribie was easy. There was a library there in one of those curved caravans, and that was it. That was the library.
The library in a caravan.
Yeah, a small caravan, which Fairweather, we'll come to that, but Fairweather used to use that quite a bit. And stocked with books from the Caboolture Library. There were a couple of small supermarkets, Renton's, where Fairweather used to buy his plastic paints and things like that. And I was on the Pumpstone Passage side, just as Fairweather was, but he was about a kilometre inland. But just a very sweet, quiet place.
A good place to work.
Perfect place to work, absolutely. And once the bridge was in by the time we got there, and people could visit and so on, and it was quite pleasant.
And so, can you tell us how you actually met Fairweather? How did you come across him?
Certainly. Bob Dickerson was living in Brisbane at the time.
This is Robert Dickerson, also an Australian artist.
And he came out to see us, and he said he'd been to see Fairweather earlier, not that day, but 6 months before, and he said, I'll take you around there. So we went around, no arrangement made to visit, he just went around. And we went in this track, just a narrow dirt track with high grass each side of it, and about 80 metres in, there were 2 big posts forming an arch. He went through this and then curved around, and there was the most extraordinary sight. The 2 Polynesian type huts in a stand of superb Bribie Island pines. Quite a beautiful vision, actually. And Fairweather was pottering around, and we met. And in time we became quite good friends. I used to regularly go around and play chess with him, for example, things like that. But that was my original encounter with him, with Bob.
And can you talk to us a bit about what his routines were in terms of the studio? Can you describe the studio? We actually have some images of these images were taken by Robert Walker, who visited Fairweather a couple of times on Bribie. And what was your impression of, sometimes routines and especially for painters are very regimented and structured. How were Fairweather's routines?
Well, we're talking 1970. I think it slowed down quite a bit, and I don't know what his painting timetable was at that point. He still painted in the first painting. He had the 2 bungalows there the 2 thatched cottages there in 1970. But then he later on had to pull one down. We'll come to that, but it's a sad story. But he was still painting in one and eating and cooking. We didn't do much cooking, but by that time it was mostly takeaway. He'd go to a store and buy tin food and things like that. So he seemed to be pretty relaxed. He's sitting outside by a little card table and aluminium chairs, and we'd drink a bit and talk. I started keeping a diary of conversations with Fairweather, but not on the spot, needless to say. When I got back to where I was staying, I racked my memory and try and get it right.
And what about his this idea of him being a hermit? Can you talk a bit about what your observances was about his contact with the outside world? I mean, I'd kind of refute that as far as knowing what he was reading and keeping up to date with magazines, etc. What's your impression?
He's certainly not a hermit. You never get a hermit who goes to a library once a week and gets books and goes to the corner store and gets Time magazine, things like that. That's not the behaviour of a hermit, really.
True.
But he regularly went to the store on Tuesday to get his provisions and so on. And I'm sure he had access to magazines like Time Mag and so on, because I saw one in his hut one day, and we talked about it. But no, he had visitors. He was quite open to visitors coming in. He liked company. He didn't like hordes of people coming in, but he liked one-on-one, if he could organise it. And great! All the painters went up there one by one. Olsen, Billy Rose, Roy Churcher and his children. They had sort of picnics and things with him. He enjoyed the company.
And one thing you both had in common, Lawrence, was that you'd both spent very formative parts of your career in London. I mean, you'd just come from swinging 60s London, which must have been amazing at that time. And he'd spent years studying at the Slade School in the 1920s. Did you talk about London? Did he talk about his training and that time?
He talked about his training with Tonks and so on, but he also talked more about his early childhood. How he went bird nesting and that sort of thing on the island where he was living with his two aunts and his...
On Jersey, in the Channel Islands, where he spent a lot of
he
his...
talked a great deal about that, but not so much the training, although the training technically would have been identical to my training at the National Gallery School in Melbourne, where he spent technically a year in the cast room just doing drawing, and then a year doing still life painting, a year doing figure, and then a year doing composition, which is pretty academic. And he would have had the same structure that Tonks, I think, at the Slade.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to think about how many Australian artists also studied at the Slade School, which was the kind of the ultimate in the most formal academic training, especially for English artists. And I just was looking at it this morning. You know, Godfrey Miller, Robert Clipple, Kenneth McQueen, Betty and Roy Churcher. And then more recently, Ian Friend and Anne Wallace, all trained, spent some time training at the Slade School.
Yeah, well, you see the drawings that Fairweather did there, they were extraordinary, quite beautiful.
We have some in our collection. You can see images online of our very early Fairweather Slade School drawings. Yeah. What about London whilst you were there?
Well, that was a pretty interesting time. The Whitechapel exhibition brought a whole lot of Australian painters over there, and we spent a lot of time together while that was on, and then a number of us stayed on. Brett Whiteley, Charlie Blackman, Arthur Boyd had been there already for quite a while. Sid Nolan had been there for quite a long time. And we all hung out with each other. We spent a lot of time. In fact, we all got married in 1962.
All of you at once?
Not to each other. No, Brett married Wendy. Michael Johnson married Margot. I married my first wife, all in the same year, in 62. And Roland Slick, who became involved in the field painting in Australia, he was an architect, became a painter. He got married the same year, so it was quite a year, 62. But we did hang around a lot together, and I spent a lot of time with Brett, and finished up in Ladbroke Grove again, where he and Michael were. But
and you said that you mentioned that you'd come across the Time magazine. Fairweather had come across the Time magazine article on Brett. Can you talk about that?
Yes, he had, and he was. It's like an old walrus checking out the young walrus. He sort of had a sense that there's a bit of a young Turk here, you know. And it was an article by Robert Hughes, including talking about Brett, and in the Time magazine where he was art critic, and had an image or two of Brett's and so on. And Fairweather was quite fascinated by, first of all, what he read about Brett. And I have a feeling that other people, like Olsen and other people, may have talked to him about Brett because he had something building up in his head. So he had a good set of radars going for
the latest in what was
talent. Yeah, but it was very much like the old walrus, just checking out the young one. Because when I was in London, I hadn't met Brett before, but in 1961, I think, I'd seen a lot of Arthur Boyd, and he said, Brett's arrived. We all knew about Brett. Brett's arrived. He'd been in Italy on the Dante Alighieri scholarship. And he said, would you like to meet him? I said, sure. He said, I'll bring him around this afternoon. So I was working in my studio above the ABC bread shop in Hampstead High Street. And I could look down and I saw this taxi arrive. And this figure leapt out, Harpo Marx, literally, Harpo Marx leapt out and reached in and sort of helped what I thought was an old man. It was Arthur, who was only 40 or something at the time. Anyway, they came up into the studio, and Brett, I was mesmerised by this Brett. He was bouncing around the studio, dropping names like Vincent, Francis, Piero. These are all first-name heroes, you know. And he's jumping around with his hair. And meanwhile, Arthur's sort of whinging a bit, saying, he helped me out like I was an octogenarian, you know. Sort of thing. And it was the same principle of, was Brett just being generous, or was he doing the young walrus checking the old walrus out? It seemed very like it.
A changing of the guard, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, London in the 60s, there was this incredible kind of welcoming of the Australians too at that time, the Australian artists, wasn't there? And the Whitechapel show that Lawrence is referring to, Ian Fairweather was actually included. It was a big, important exhibition of Australian artists that went to London and really made a lot of people's careers.
It made an enormous difference, well, certainly did to me, and to all of us, because the Whitechapel opened doors that never opened before. For example, let's see, Charlie Blackman, Brett and I were chosen to be in the under-35 Biennale in Paris because of the Whitechapel thing.
Mm.
We went to Paris in the Biennale. The three of us got our first one-man shows with the Matisse Gallery. So it really opened up doors just like that, the whole thing. But also it united quite a few of the artists who didn't know each other very well. And we tend to spend quite a bit of time for the 2 or 3 years after that. And then a whole lot of other new faces came over. Colin Lansley came over, Clipple came over, Robert Clipple, and moved in. They were quite and Xstrata was the flavour of the month, really, for the first 5 years of the 60s on.
Extraordinary. And then you were on Bribie Island and reading about all of this.
Quite a contrast.
Half a world away. But I wanted to ask a bit more about Fairweather's relationship to the Bribie Island community and how he was a part of that.
Okay. Well, I'd like to establish one thing, that it's the sheer happenstance that got him to Bribie. He'd been living way back, when was it? 45, I think, in Sandgate. And it's almost like a replica of the raft trip. He'd got a boat, put a mast on it, rigged it a bit, and put provisions in and just pushed off. He had a great desire to get north into the tropical area of Cairns and up that way. He'd worked out tides and everything, but he hadn't worked it out enough. He hopped in the boat, pushed it off, and away they went. And sure enough, the tide swept him out of Moreton Bay and up the coast towards Caloundra. And so far so good, but then he should have anchored and then waited for the next tide, but he didn't. And the tide changed and swept him right back into Moreton Bay, right up Pumice-Stone Passage, beyond where the bridge is now, to a place called Sunderland Beach. Now Sunderland was a beekeeper, and he let Fairweather live in a little cottage there for a while. And I think Fairweather said he looked after the place when he went off, when Sunderland went off for a week or two. But it was a sad time in a way for Fairweather, because there was a small group of army people bivouacked on the other side of the Pumice-Stone Passage, and they came over one night, ransacked his little shack, and stole his diaries. Now those diaries would have been incalculably valuable. You know, I just imagine what might have been in them. Anyway, he was only there for about 7 months, but the code was set for Bribie because years later, in '52, when he did his raft trip, and the nightmare that followed that when they threw him in prison and he got to England, didn't like that. His relatives sent him back to Sydney in '53, and the first thing he did when he got to Sydney was head straight for Bribie Island, and found that beautiful spot, started building his huts, and from '52 until 53 until '63, he produced probably his most beautiful, profound works, I'd say.
Absolutely. And you did mention that he actually held a small exhibition on Bribie Island?
Yes, he did.
He didn't have a show in Brisbane, so there were all of his works were sent to Sydney for exhibition at the Macquarie Galleries in just one gallery. But Lawrence tells a story about a Bribie Island exhibition.
Yeah, well, he would have walked past this church, the Church of England there, and had a hall attached to it. Every Tuesday he'd go shopping with his little bag and get his ration of oval tins of mackerel mostly, and then he'd go tootling off to the library and get a book or two. But he somehow made contact with using this hall at the back of the church. He felt he'd like to say thank you to the Bribie people or to Bribie for his presence and the good life he had there. And they let him have an exhibition there. But, in hindsight, I almost wince when I think how it would be. He never had frameworks lying around. They'd just be on paper like you're painting on thin card.
Yeah.
Whether he went there with a hammer and nails or tacks and tacked them up on the wall or drawing pins, they wouldn't have been framed. They've just pinned up. And I mean, because I look at them now, there's probably some with little pin marks in there.
There are. If you look closely, you can definitely see.
It came and went. The locals probably wondered what on earth this is about, but there they were.
Yeah.
Probably 15, 20 works pinned up.
Australia's greatest painter having a small show in Bribie Island. They wouldn't really have known what kind of context to bring to these works. No. Yeah. So he had a lot of affection for the Bribie Islanders, and many of them did for him as well. He had some very close friends, didn't he?
He did. They visited him fairly regularly. He had, apart from the locals that he liked, there was Fleming, the taxi driver. He was his great friend. And there was a hotel on the ocean side and another one smaller one around near the golf course. And Fleming would often just stop there. They had a takeaway thing, and he'd get a bit of takeaway for Ian. And we all did every now and then. We'd grab a bit of stuff and take it around for him. But Fleming was really, he'd call in and keep track on him, make sure he was okay. In fact, it was he who eventually found him, quite ill, just before he went to hospital. But Fairweather had a mixture of visitors. I'll describe one that would have given him a bit of a shock. He described how one day he observed this fellow in a three-piece suit in Bribie, which is pretty unusual for starters. And he was darting behind trees, and he had a camera with a telephoto lens out here somewhere, and taking photos, click, of Fairweather from a long way away. And this went on for two or 3 hours, and he disappeared. The next day, he's back again, still in his three-piece suit, click, and he's getting nearer and nearer to Fairweather, so, he's feeling a bit easier about being seen. And finally, he stepped out from behind a tree, walked up to Fairweather, and put out his hand and said, "Ian, I'm your brother Arthur." Which would have been a great shock for poor old Fairweather, But apparently, Arthur had married into a French winemaking family and doing quite well in France. And his wife was there, and he had to report back to see if he thought it would be okay if they met up with Fairweather and took him out for a meal or whatever. But
did he talk much about his family?
He talked a little about it, but not a great deal. There was one that went to America. He described they were all doing quite well, and when he talked about it, he made you think that he wasn't doing quite well, but in fact he was doing quite well in spirit anyway.
And about his upbringing and did he talk about his time in the war or?
He talked about the war a great deal when he was a prisoner of war, and 2 attempts to escape successfully, and then they carted him back. But how he described how they disguised themselves and things like that in big grey German overcoats, to make it look as though
they were soldiers.
Yeah, and they tied a great thick sausage around their neck for food to make it bulge out or something, and also to have food. He talked about that quite a bit in a random sort of way. He was very aware of what he called the regiment. So there must have been quite a few of the soldiers of his regiment, prisoners. And he talked about a connection with, well, maybe we shouldn't talk about it. No, we talked about connection with a woman. And who knows what she was or whatever, but he said he couldn't bring her into the mess with the regiment. So I don't know what that meant, but it's the only time he ever mentioned a woman. But anyway, that period was pretty important in his head. He talked about it on and off quite a bit.
Absolutely. And another great theme of the exhibition is some of the influence of Chinese art upon his works. Did you talk about his travels in Asia?
Yes, he did. When he was really poor, he was really struggling. He loved the life there, even poor, and he was working as an overseer on a road mending gang. And he quite enjoyed it, and he said it was so cheap. They could send out for food and it would be brought up and so on. And he loved it, and considering he obviously had no money at all. He loved all that particular time. And he talked about Bali later on. That was some of his happiest days, I think.
Mm. And one question that's always intrigued me, and looking at Gethsemane and Epiphany in the exhibition, did you ever get a sense of his spirituality, his beliefs, or any sense of religion?
No, not in any conventional concept of the religion, but he had a oneness with the landscape, almost identifying with the land and people and life. What's the word? I can't think of it. Anyway, it was like a religious sense of it all. There is a word. What on earth is it? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But he never talked about, to me anyway, about Christ and formal church things and Old Testament stories and so on. I don't know if he even had a Bible, but he would have been inundated, not inundated, introduced into that by his two aunts and the grandmother, I think, from early on. But I was surprised that he did turn to religious subject matter when he did, because it wasn't there earlier on and it wasn't there later on, just that one period where it came up. But no, he had if I could think of that wretched word, a oneness with the landscape and people. It was quite beautiful.
And birds as well, you talked about
birds indeed. He had birds sitting on his shoulder. I thought, God, it's St. Francis of Assisi all over again. It's the magpies and so on. And once I remember Rudy Coleman wanted to meet him. So
Rudy Coleman was an art dealer from Sydney.
And Rudy brought up cases of wine, because he heard that Fairweather liked wine. We went on this picnic, we organised a picnic, and Fairweather was sitting, it was only about 2 kilometres from where he lived, and Fairweather was sitting there, and suddenly there were the 3 magpies, his pet magpies, one on his shoulder, and 2 just nearby, and he's giving them little bits of crust and things. They followed him around, but I didn't know magpies did that. But no, he loved the birds, but he loved his trees, the Bribie Island pine trees. They're still there, and they've cleared around a bit, but they're it's the most beautiful copse of Bribie Island pine. And he was forced to build a small house at some stage, and when he died, they gave the house to the Boy Scout group on the island. But the slab can still be seen there today on the ground.
Yes, and some of you may have been there. But can you talk a bit about why the house had to be built? That was a bit of a trouble with the local council, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Let's see, when would it be? 1970, I think. He was awarded by a medal, which was organised by his peer group painters for his contribution to Australian art. And he was going to be awarded this medal on Bribie Island, and the ABC sent a film crew up to record this. And in the course of the conversation for the cameras, the interviewer asked, Mr. Fairweather, are you comfortable? Are you really comfortable here in these huts sort of thing? And Fairweather said, oh yes, I'm very comfortable, except for the rats. And this is all going to air eventually.
Right.
And rumour has it that the mayor of Caboolture almost snarled, let's get this bum off the island, you know. But anyway, that's only rumour. But they weren't happy about it, so much so that they insisted that he pull one of his huts, Malaysian or Polynesian type huts down, and build a proper house. which he did. But Margaret Olley at that time helped him a great deal with organising that. It was a minimum size, I don't know what you call it now, like 1.4 squares or something, just a little minute thing with a veranda. And then they could bring in electricity and water, two things he'd never experienced before. And he had a bath, but I know that he never used it because it was full of junk and stuff, you know. But he had electricity, which helped quite a bit, because before that, he didn't even have Coleman-type pressure lamps. He would be painting in his huts there with kerosene lamps, you know, the old-fashioned kerosene lamp. So his eyesight must have been pretty good to paint the way he did with that couple of those going.
It's a very different light, isn't it? Kind of flickering and, yeah. And inside those huts, it was quite dark too. It's
very dark inside, yeah. And he did work at night. I know he did work at night. He told me he used to work at night. He'd get up, suddenly want to do something and get to work on it.
Yeah, extraordinary. But there was a lot of controversy at the time. In the newspaper, the local Bribie Island councillors saying that he's not paying tax and...
Yeah, apparently he had some problem with tax. I think the Macquarie Gallery had been stockpiling money for him and putting it in an account and things like that. And there was a bit of a query about all that, but he owed the tax people and it was a 5-figure sum or something. But that was all resolved, I think. He had two people looking after his affairs. Colonel Pollard, who was a friend of the family's in London, he lived in Buderim, and an accountant who I thought his name was Barrett, but somebody told me it was some other name, but I remembered him as Barrett. Anyway, the two of them would come to see Fairweather once a month. I happened to be there on 2 occasions when they came, and they'd disappear either into the hut the first time in the 70s, and later when the hut was built, they disappeared into the hut. And Fairweather was literally just signing cheques, things like that. You know, that he knew nothing about his finances, really. He thought he didn't have... He was under the impression he didn't have a lot of money, but of course he did. Macquarie had been holding quite a swag of money for him.
I suppose after so many years of being in such dire financial straits, it would be...
Well, yeah, when getting to the point, his age at that point, he's feeling a bit uneasy about it, but I think they sorted it out in the end. But they were actually looking after his affairs completely, Colonel Pollard in particular, and this accountant, and they were the executors of the will as well.
And so you were there at the end, Lawrence, when he died?
Yeah. Yeah, when the funeral was held at Petrie? No. What's it called? On the way out of Brisbane. Aspley. And a lot of people from Brisbane came, and 5 of us went from Bribie Island. Fleming and his wife, the librarian, she came, and Edith and I were there. It was a cold, wet, miserable day, and a few people spoke, and then we all went back to Bribie. But on the way back, the Bruce Highway wasn't anywhere near like it is now. We had to go around through Launton to get there and all that sort of thing. And we stopped at the Launton pub and had a sort of a mini wake for him. And I think Fleming, who had a rather perverse sense of humour, this is after Ian had been cremated, he said, "Trust Ian to find the warmest spot on a day like this," which we thought was a pretty bizarre thing to be saying.
So I think, Lawrence, you know, I mean, whilst your work and Ian Fairweather's work, your paintings and your practices come from very different places, and he wasn't an influence on you so much artistically, what do you think you took from meeting this extraordinary person and having a sense and contact with his life and the way he worked? Do you think he's had an effect? He had an effect on you?
It certainly has had a great effect on me, but also he has a great effect on most of the artists. I'll give you an example. When Macquarie were having exhibitions of his in the heyday sort of thing, they'd be queuing up on the pavement the night before and camping out to have first stab at the show the next morning. And half of those people were painters. Painters loved Fairweather, loved the idea of him. And it wasn't so much the work, they loved... He became their conscience in a way because he was dealing directly with his own person, boom. Whereas it implied, in a sense, they all felt that we all felt, and we did, in fact, we did make compromises in our life, you know, to do whatever. And Fairweather was almost like our conscience in the sense he never made compromises like that. He just, whatever was available, he just used that and evolved his life brilliantly.
Complete and utter focus and
absolutely
no distractions.
No.
Yeah. And is that something that you took? You also talked about the way that you lived and where you chose to live.
Certainly, it made a big difference to my concept of where I want to live. Brad was in Sydney by then, and he suggested I come down there. But I would have had to use at least 15% of energy just to neutralise the background of Sydney, and that's my personality about it. So that's why we chose to finish up in the mountains in the thing. But also, he made me realise you don't need a lot. You just need something quite simple, and just get on with your painting and so on. So we found a place which we added to eventually and built big studios and all that. But the basic place we found was an old army hut on a pineapple 40-acre pineapple farm. And the hut had actually come from Bribie Island after the war, after World War II. And the farmer had brought it over there, not for anyone to live in, but for the workers to eat their lunch in and things like that. So there's quite a Bribie connection to that. And it's not just a simple 60 by 20 building, but then we added verandas and more rooms, and I built a large studio and garages and all that. So originally it was just simple. Fairweather came up there, saw the hut, in fact, once in 1973, I think. And I had some books lying around. We weren't living there, it was just an empty shell, but I did have a few books lying around. He immediately seized a big, thick catalogue from the Marlborough Gallery of Francis Bacon. And he went straight to it, almost unerringly, so he knew something there. And he was sitting in the manager of the place had an old car seat, a bright orange plastic car seat. And Fairweather was sitting in this, engrossed in this Francis Bacon catalogue. It's quite a strange image. I should have photographed it. I did photograph stuff, with the Polaroids, and they don't last the distance, they disintegrate in time.
They do. Well, I mean, thank you, Laurie. That's such an inspirational kind of story and narrative about connections between artists and the way that artists can inspire and influence each other, not just through their works, but through communities and friendships and connections that are made. So maybe we should open this up to questions and have a bit of a further discussion. Does anybody have any questions for Lawrence? Yes?
Did Ian ever have female companions?
The question was, did Fairweather ever have female companions on Bribie Island?
Well, no, anyway.
Oh.
Anywhere? Well, I don't know about anywhere. I didn't know in different places. To the best of my knowledge, he didn't have any intimate female companions, but he had a lot of female company that come to Bribie, and I've seen photographs of him entertaining females, as such, with wine glasses in hand and so on. So I think he quite liked the idea of and the memory of that sort of life at some stage, but he carried on with it a bit, not right at the end, but he certainly had plenty of female company.
Yes?
How aware was he of Pollock and the abstract expressions? How much was he keeping in contact and what was happening internationally?
I'll just repeat the question, which was how aware was he of, say, Jackson Pollock and the American abstract expressionists, how much was he keeping in touch with what was happening in the most advanced art internationally?
I personally don't know that, but I have read somewhere that a book of abstracts, and it included Pollock and the American boys, was one that he may have seen. I've forgotten who wrote it. Starts with an S. Do you know that?
That was he did read in Brisbane the dictionary of abstract art that the French art dealer Michel Suffort had put together in the late 50s, and that included a whole range of different artists working in abstraction, and very much up until that point. So he was, and I think he'd sought that book out. He was seeking to know what was the most, avant-garde, the most progressive practices at that time. And he certainly was, these artists were featured in Time magazine and The Atlantic and all of those magazines as well. This is kind of, it's interesting because it also coincides with that time that certain artists start to become celebrities in a way, don't they? And Brett Whiteley certainly gets caught up in that in a very, particular way.
Yeah.
And you're talking about Fairweather as being this inspiration towards a very completely different understanding of the artist. But does that answer your question? Yeah. Ross?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. I was just going to ask Laurie, did you ever watch Fairweather work?
No, certainly not.
And what was the relationship of the picture plane to the floor? Was it always tilted, or did he work sometimes on the picture plate? Do you know if
It was mostly vertical.
Yeah.
I saw where he worked and how he worked, but not him actually painting. But almost straight vertical, not just tilted slightly.
Yeah.
And lots of running down on the bottom for everything.
And did he ever talk about painting?
No. He said one thing, we're talking about painting, and it's the only thing he ever really said about it. He said, and I quoted this to Sandra McGrath, and she attributed it to me as though it's the way I paint, and it's a million miles the way I paint. It's exactly the way Fairweather painted. And he told me, he said, I like to make a mess and then make order out of it, and then it is totally me, which is a lovely concept, actually. But that was Fairweather, certainly not the way I paint.
No. Very different.
If only.
Any other? Yes.
I've read 70 layers of paint they found on his artwork. Did you, in your time, see artwork disappear and come back? Did you see painting on the wall just...
Oh, Fairweather?
Fairweather's?
No. I never saw pictures in his painting area in the cottage, no. But by that time, and he became allergic to oil paint early on, and he was using polymers and so on. And he had loads of pots around with brushes in, and he'd be putting thin, thick layers on, washing them back and all that sort of stuff. No, I never saw any work on the wall as such.
Yes.
Do you know if he worked on several paintings at once, or did he work on one painting until it was finished?
I think he generally worked on one, but he had 3 areas where he could work, so he could well have had 3 things on the go at any one time. One was a large area, and then 2 smaller areas. He worked on card, and the card was about, and even the big paintings are comprised of a series of that size, thin cardboard, stuck together. Seemed to be a standard. He must have had a stack of it there somewhere. So he could easily have been working on smaller work while he was on a big one. But I have a feeling the big ones preoccupied him, because in that prime period from 53 to 63, when he produced extraordinary paintings, some of the great ones, Monastery, Monsoon, the religious paintings and so on, he put a little character after his Chinese IF, in Fairweather stuff, just a special Chinese character. And I asked him what it meant, and he said, and he sort of smiled, and he said it means propitious day, fantastic day, beautiful day. And I thought, wow, he must have felt so good, when he only put it on 5 paintings in his whole life, just those major ones. So he must have felt pretty good. Boy, I wish I could feel that good.
Yes, you.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was going to ask the use of newspaper and you said full card. Why?
Well, he didn't need a heavy vehicle like canvas because he wasn't painting on oil with oil paints and so on. And I think just the expediency of having a quick vehicle there that he could use. And I think he must have run out of card at some point and got going on the newspaper. But other people have done that. Passmore in Sydney did a great swag of paintings on newspaper. Whether they wanted, in Passmore's case, the lettering to come through as part of it or not. Certainly Fairweather wasn't interested in the lettering coming through. But no, I think he just grabbed anything, you know.
Yes.
I wonder, did he have a Scottish accent?
What?
Well, did he have a Scottish accent?
No, not really. No, he had a very soft voice. I met his nephew, who looked very much like Fairweather, and he had a very Scottish accent, but Fairweather didn't, no.
You can actually hear in the exhibition space, we've have on display some interviews that a great oral historian, Hazel de Berg, interviewed many Australian artists in the 1960s, and she interviewed Ian Fairweather twice. There were 2 interviews in the space where it's just Ian Fairweather's words talking about his upbringing and his working methods. So I'd encourage you to have a listen to those, hear the artist's words themselves whilst looking at the paintings.
Yeah.
Any further questions? Probably got time for one more. No burning. Yes, Julie.
Can I ask you a bit more about Bali? Can I press you on Bali? The books all say that he was very happy and it was a very productive, though short time of about 9 months. Is there anything more you can remember about anyone he was staying with, the Americans on the beach?
No. In Bali? No. No. I only remember about it. But he was, you're right, he was very happy there. That's one of the reasons he headed off on the raft to get back there, you know. He's just so happy in Bali. I don't know who he met there or anything.
So he didn't ever talk too much about that?
Not about Bali, no. He talked about China more than Bali.
Well, so much information and insight, and there are still burning mysteries, as I think there'll always be. Thank you so much, Lawrence.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,